All right, that was a bit of a quick change. Pit stop. This is the session on policy. And my name is Naomi Stead, and it is my very great pleasure to be your chair for this afternoon session from the top, The Potential of Policy. We have a really fascinating group of women on the panel, each with quite distinct interests and engagements with policy, why it matters, how it works, how it doesn't work sometimes, and how it can be made to work more effectively towards a more equitable, diverse and inclusive architecture profession. I must say that, as Justine mentioned this morning, she invited me to chair this session because I have a particular fascination for policy, as an amateur kind of fascination. And I hope that one day someone might call me a wonk, which is that, you know, that strange word they only ever use in relation to policy, a wonk. But I've been reflecting on why, what it is that I find compelling about policy and why I believe in its power, and whether it could be perhaps the collectiveness of the umbrella of policy, its effect on communality, it's bringing people together, potentially, ideally, or perhaps its orderliness and its structure and the clarity and transparency of explicit parameters and frameworks, the sense of everybody knowing exactly where they stand. But ultimately, I think it's this, the sense of both an organisation and an individual knowing their obligations but also their rights, the agreed rules or law which say what can be rightfully claimed and demanded, and the consequences or recourse if that promise is not fulfilled. Because for me, I think that this is what policy can or should provide, the kind of rules of engagement between the top and the grassroots working together towards a more equitable world. Policy should give collective strength and recourse to individuals. It should give precision and accountability to organisations. It should set a course and help everyone to navigate towards that. But of course, it doesn't always work that way. And I'm looking forward to hearing about some of the complexities and failings of policy from our panellists, as well as their hopes for what it might achieve and how. So first, I'm going to very briefly introduce our panellists, and then they're each going to give a short 5-minute-ish presentation of what work they've been doing in this area and their particular interest in this area. And also on the related question of institutional and organisational leadership from the top. So, you'll tell us what you do and why. And this introduction will be followed by a panel discussion of approximately 45 minutes. Then we'll open to questions from the floor and finish at 4 p.m. Our panellists in order are Amy Muir, the President of the Victorian chapter of the Australian Institute of Architects, who has been active in using the Institute's gender equity policy as leverage for change as an elected representative. She is now on the committee that is charged with delivering on that policy and has initiated a review of the policy in her role on National Council. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not on the committee, I'm not on the gender committee, but certainly on National Council supporting change.
Very good. Jocelyn Chiew is the chair of the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, or AILA's Gender Equity Working Group, which currently has a major program of action underway. Jocelyn is also manager, campus design, quality and planning at Monash University, my own institution, so she brings a client-side perspective also to the conversation. Natalie Galea is an academic with a background in construction management at the University of New South Wales. Natalie has done wonderful work looking at the update and effectiveness of equity policy within large construction companies and is very articulate about what needs to happen for policy to gain traction. She's also the genius behind the Gender on the Tender campaign, which creates a framework for embedding gender equity within the procurement process from the very beginning. I hope we will hear more about that. At the end, Emily Grandstaff-Rice is an experienced advocate, leader and policymaker in the US context, where the American Institute of Architects has a long history of equity policies and initiatives stretching back until at least 1968. Emily was the chair of the year-long Equity in Architecture Commission, which delivered its recommendations to the American Institute of Architects Board in 2016. One of the recommendations was to make a board-level committee to track ongoing progress in perpetuity. This committee is named the Equity and the Future of Architecture Committee, and Emily has chaired it since 2016 and will continue until December next year. She's also been instrumental in establishing the AIA Women's Leadership Summit and the AIA Guides for Equitable Practice, which we've seen earlier, which take Parlour's own guides as a model. but expands them beyond gender to take better account of other underrepresented groups according to ethnicity, race, ability, LGBTIQ plus status, non-binary status, ability, and so on. It's fair to say that Emily has been centrally involved in the development and delivery of equity, diversity and inclusion policy in architecture in the US, and the latest Women's Leadership Summit in September had around 700 attendees, which she believes is the largest ever gathering of women architects.
We don't know.
We're guessing. It might be a pretty safe guess.
Yes.
So each of the panellists is going to introduce themselves for 5 minutes, strictly. And we don't have a particular order, so perhaps we'll just proceed.
All right. I was sort of last night and this morning thinking about what are some of the little things that you have in your life. I think all of these issues and advocacy and policy, at the end of the day, what is fascinating about the world we live in, everyone comes to a position from a very different background and a very different context and a very different history. So it's a, you know, these spaces are incredibly complex. But I was just sort of reflecting on some of the things that have happened in my life that have been little points. And I was remembering one of the first points, sort of growing up, a younger sister, a mother and a father who was never mentioned the fact that we were girls, it just was a thing. But being in year 8, and I was at a co-ed school, very small co-ed school, and we were that term looking at Lord of the Flies, and each English class we were to read from Lord of the Flies, and because every character was a male character, only the boys in the class got to read. And so we were going to have to deal with that for a whole term. And I think I got to about, from memory, I think I probably got to about week 3. And I was never, I never really sort of said much, but I just put my hand up and I said, is there going to be an opportunity for us to mix this thing up a bit and, to have a bit of a go? And it was made very clear, no, you're female, so there are no female parts in this book. So this is it. And I think after a couple more weeks, I must have said it again, just because I was starting to get a little bit fed up, and got sent to the principal's office. And I think that was probably the first time that it started to dawn on me that you do actually have to say things, and also quite shocked that there wasn't an alternative. And then I think moving through, in my first interview when I finished year 12, going into an interior design interview, and that was in 1993, and I was interviewed by 6 males, yet the course was 80% female, 20% male. And so it was, once again, it was just sort of this skewed, and I'd come, in the last few years of my education, had been in an all-girls school where, once again, never questioned, you were never told that you were female and that you had to excel in a particular way. You were just completely supported through an education, and it wasn't a gender education, it was an education. And so these sort of little blips that sort of pop up in life, I think, are really sort of fascinating views of other people's worlds or your world and how you're sort of sitting within it. And then I think I was sort of remembering as well, at the end of the architecture course, I was given an award which was the Association of Women in Architecture Prize, and I was horrified. I was totally mortified. And at that time, this is 2002, and I mean, now I look back on it, that was an incredibly naive response, but I was mortified that I couldn't be recognised as a person for, in terms of from a professional point of view. Anyway, and I think, we all have experienced various things in our profession, but I was just reflecting as well on Alison Cleary, who was just sitting in this seat a moment ago, who was the manager of the Victorian chapter, and in 2012 asked me to join the awards committee. And Alison was a huge champion of women and gender equity, and the committees very much were supporting 50-50. And it was really interesting because I got onto that committee in 2012, and it was 50. There were 3 males, 3 females within the committee. However, I realised very quickly one of our tasks on that awards committee is to work out who the jurors are going to be for the awards. And in the juries, we have 14 categories, 3 jurors per category. And there were, despite our committee, there were only 85%, well, not only, there were 85% of those chair jury roles were dedicated to men. And so it became very evident that we had a complete imbalance in our representation on juries. And so that we started, and it wasn't through anyone not thinking that wasn't a good or a bad thing. It just wasn't a thing. It just wasn't being talked about. And so I think we started, really talking about it and ensuring that, each year we were committing to lifting the bar. And in 2018, I think we had 50-50, male-female for the chair roles, and I think we got to 47% females across the board, 53 males. And then the following year, this year, 2019, same thing, 50-50, but we ended up with 55 females versus 45 males. So it was just, I think, these sort of little exercises, and I think, we sort of talk about standing up, and I'll talk more about that when we go into sort of talking more broadly about policy, but how do we stand up? How do we go about doing that? This sort of idea of a conversation about something and reminding people and constantly being sort of on call. Anyway.
Fabulous. Thank you. Do we clap after each? No, let's just keep going. Jocelyn.
Okay. Look, I've coming to this from a bit of a strange vantage point, I guess. I've grown up with Chinese Malaysian parents who have never been to China and have also spent most of their life here now in Australia. A lot of my childhood was spent doing a lot of outdoor sports, mountain biking, etc., with generally male friends. So I was very used to interacting with males and females, but generally in a sport-based activity. So that meant a lot of doing and not a lot of talking. So I've spent a lot of my sort of more recent professional life, I guess, trying to work out what my voice is and actually giving that some action. I've learnt that it's not enough just to work really hard. To be seen, you have to be heard. And so that's what I've spent quite a bit of time on doing. And that's, I guess, part of the driver behind the work that I'm doing now at Monash University, but also for AILA. So at Monash University, I've been responsible for the last 9 years for implementing the master plan vision for Caulfield and Clayton campuses, and this is now extended based off the success of that over to our Parkville and Peninsula campuses. At the time that I started working at Monash, design wasn't a part of our language. I work in the Buildings and Property Division. It's very project manager oriented, time, budget, delivery. And so a lot of our work has been around asking the question, what are we delivering as an expert service? What is what are we doing that's contributing to the estate? And so this is where because this is a session on policy, I want to just qualify that I don't actually have specific delivered experience in gender equity policy yet. I'll come to that in a sec. But so my experience in delivered policy is around design. And at Monash University, we've introduced a master plan that sets out a vision for each campus. We developed a tagline to bring everyone along on the journey. Someone said in one of the sessions this morning that narrative is important. I can't emphasise that more. It is really, really important, especially when you're talking to non-architects who may not understand design and, frankly, don't understand the benefit of it, and all they can see is cost and time and difficulty, I guess. So challenge, especially where we're sort of advocating for co-design processes. So lots of different voices. So as part of the master plan implementation, we said that the story behind the master plans is that we're working towards this vision that benefits everyone. Every piece of work you do, whether it's strategic or operational, whether you're a dean or whether you're a plumber, whether you're installing exposed piping or whether it's a new building, that contributes to the master plan vision. And so we need to make sure that we're interrogating it enough and making sure that it is actually contributing and not detracting from, getting to that place that we need to be. And so over the last 10 years, we've actually, created environments, campuses that are much more inclusive, much more attractive, and much more welcoming, much more transparent, and connected, and are hopefully much more enjoyable. We're seeing more people on them, and they've been supported by policies for architectural selection, for design review, for design approval, for public art, and for memorials as well. That's been our most recent one. With AILA, AILA commissioned a census report similar to the architectural one that Justine and Naomi spoke about this morning, and that census report identified a number of issues with the landscape architecture profession at the moment in the area of gender equity. And so this year we set up a working group, and I chair that working group, and we've got a number of really wonderful members inputting into that from all around the country. And we've drafted I should say that building on Gillian's census report and her next steps report, we've augmented that next steps report. So those two reports were written by Gillian and produced by Parlour and XY. Well, are both by XYX Lab and Parlour? No. Yes. Okay. And yes. Okay. And then and AILA's commissioned those. And so we've augmented the next steps report with how that might be delivered, and we've also drafted a policy, and we're hoping to release that to members in the coming weeks, certainly before Christmas, I hope. And I guess that's about it for me for now.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks Jocelyn. Natalie.
Yeah, hi. My story starts as well with sport. I'm on my third career currently. There may be more in the future. But my first career was as an Olympic athlete, and then my second was as a construction project manager, and my third is now as an academic. And I often joke to industry that I've had a steep decline in legitimacy. My sporting career was interesting. I knew exactly what I needed to do as a judo player to get to that podium, to get to the gold medal. But I spent about 15, 17 years in my construction career scratching my head, being the only woman in the room and not knowing how I was to progress, because hard work, despite the fact that I put in a great amount of effort, was not paying off. I did what I thought I had to do. I moved overseas. I tried to follow suit, and it really didn't get me too far. So in about 2012, as luck would have it, I went for a cut and colour at the hairdresser in Dubai, and long story short, met my supervisor that way, and we got an ARC research grant out of a research project that looked at why it was in the construction sector that despite this sort of raised awareness of gender equality and a lot of big construction companies having a very well-developed suite of policies, why it was that women's participation rate was stalling, if not going backwards, and what was beneath that. And I think, going back to my sporting analysis, the rules of the game are really important. And certainly in our research project, we started out and we analysed 2 large Tier 1 contractors' suite of policies, and importantly, probably the thing we didn't analyse until we got to site was that contract, and that's still an important formal rule. But the other thing is the importance of the informal rules that happen on those sites, and how they often bump against or trump and interact with some of those formal policies. And I think I'm having a hoop hearing issue as well. So I think from our research perspective, we spent a lot of time giving feedback to the sector. In short, we found that the policies that were being in place were sitting in isolation at the head office, and they actually weren't taking into consideration the practices on a construction site. They were effectively, companies were treating how they budgeted for and human or didn't humanly resource their projects, but how they carried on and conducted their construction business as gender neutral and not having any gendered effects. And so in short, most of those policies were focused on fixing women rather than actually addressing or recognising that the rules in use were gendered or had gendered effects or had unintended consequences. And that ranged from everything from how they budgeted projects in terms, particularly, say, for instance, parental leave, if it was a group cost or a project cost. If it was a project cost, there was enormous backlash to anybody going on to parental leave. And also things like, how you costed up IT, for instance. These all had gendered implications. And so from that research, it was really interesting to see how, you have very different formal and informal rules in use that maintain male powerfulness and overrepresentation in the construction sector and undermine the author's intentions of those policies. And I just will add to your point about leadership, if I can be quite direct, which I have a habit of being, there was a real culture of denial amongst, and indifference, I would say, amongst senior leaders, a lack of understanding, and certainly a lack of ownership. And this is really important because in construction, the policies were often authored by HR people who had very little power. The power rested with the operational people, the very people who didn't have buy-in into gender equality. So that sort of summarises where I'm at. I'm still working in the construction area more now in the wellbeing space and also in the human rights area. Thank you.
Excellent.
Emily.
So I was struck when you said, what do you do and why? I think I'm a troublemaker. Why? Because it needs to be done sometimes. I am on the board of directors of the AIA, and there's sort of an interesting story of how that happened. But I do want to make one correction in that, the AIA is not perfect. And we have a long way to go in terms of policy that really welcomes and is inclusive to all. I think in 1968, the defining moment was when Dr. Whitney Young, a civil rights leader, came to the AIA and at their convention said, you distinguish yourself by your thunderous silence on civil rights. And frankly, I think it's taken us 40 plus years to even really wake up to that. There's a lot of work to be done, and it's my honor and privilege to play a small role in that. So, in 2015, there was a member resolution at the annual meeting to put AIA's feet to the fire regarding diversity and inclusion. And there's been a lot of really interesting trigger phrases for me today, and I don't think we'll have time to go into all of them. But just as one example, the AIA didn't collect gender data until 1994. And I can talk about why that was good, why that was bad as well. And so that kicked off the Equity in Architecture Commission, and that was a group of 16 subject matter experts across the country of different abilities, genders, viewpoints, orientation, and frankly also experience on the spectrum of what it means to be woke or aware of all of the issues out there. And we took our time, we took about a year, and instead of looking at sort of how we could fix the problem, it was more in terms of the orientation of what could increased equity, diversity, and inclusion look like in the profession, and what are the impacts that that could have, and really walk backwards about how we could start to begin to change the culture. I say this often, I recognize this will not happen within my lifetime. Despina Stratagakos' book will say, in U.S. culture, we won't reach gender parity in architecture until 2090. Well, that's like the most depressing thing ever to read on the subway. But here we are. And, but it is important for us to act, and it is important for us to take one step in front of the other. On that committee, some of the things that we looked at were just really basic stuff. One, and we call it diversity inclusion. We call it equity, diversity, inclusion. Diversity to have a mix. Inclusion to make sure that that mix is well managed and so that people are welcome, right? It's not enough to just have a mix, but you also need to create the right environment. And also equity, understanding that people come to the table with different needs and how, as a professional organization, you can support them. We did quickly joke that we can't call it diversity, inclusion, and equity because then it would be DIE. And that would be really embarrassing. So setting up measures so that this initiative would always tie back to the leadership of the organization. Marian Wright Edelman, you can't be what you can't see, making sure that instead of using stock images on the website, we all know those where like someone's pointing to the blueprint with their hard hat, right? And actually going in and taking real photographs of, oh my gosh, real architects, ranging to starting to collect a lot of data and measure that data and be rigorous about that. Firm self-assessments, we're still going to work on a research paper. That's TBD. The funding is there. We just need to put the measures out for it. But perhaps the most impactful thing has been the Guides for Equitable Practice, which were influenced by Parlour's amazing work. And I can't tell you how grateful we are that you led the way in that, because it gave us a pathway to start to talk about why this is important and really create guides for what we felt was important in our culture. And it also struck a chord in that the conversation for a more equitable profession has to not fall into specific buckets. In other words, it couldn't be just about gender. It had to be about the larger diaspora of everyone's experience and individual experience and how the intersectionality of that works. That's sort of a really exciting place for me to be now, thinking about ranges of abilities, ranges of experience, ranges of culture.
Mm. Well, Emily, maybe we'll start with a question to you then about how the guides have been received. I can't quite remember when they were released.
So we did them in waves. Okay, so number one, you guys wrote so well. The pressure was on. So we wanted to do it. And there seems to be this ethos in the AIA that we can do it all by ourselves, just make a committee or a task force, and it'll get done. Oh, God, no. So number one, we knew that the importance of this was critical, so we found a research partner in the University of Minnesota and now the University of Washington. So the key first part was to get an academic partner who could write it in a way that would speak both to individuals, to firms, and the profession at large. And we released 3 at a time. So our first 3 came out in March, our second 3 came out this summer, and then our last 3 will be coming out November, well, it is November, soon. Soon. They're in final copy. And then I think that we keep talking about this chapter 10. What we recognized is that because we focused on the profession so much, we really didn't bring in the student voice. So working in which we can have that conversation with the American colleges and schools of architecture, as well as our accrediting organizations. And one of the things that struck me recently was in a conversation about professional organizations and why they exist. And I'm still struggling with this, so bear with me for a second. Professional organizations, by their nature, are in a way reinforce dominant culture, right? So to be a professional, what does that mean, right? There's usually credentials, there's education, there's a certain status that one has to hold to be part of this community. And as a result, I think it also comes with the baggage, especially because architecture and design is something that you learn from others, you don't learn from a book. It reinforces patterns of behavior that have existed for, over 100 years, right? And that's a really hard juggernaut to try and, I have this image of a peeling onion, to sort of peel away the layers to get at how you can change. And just having the basic conversation about cultural competency and implicit bias has been critical for us, which is why our guides lead with that, because we can't start to talk about pay equity, negotiation, and building equitable communities until we have that initial basic foundation of why diversity and inclusion is important. And so I think that has been an interesting viewpoint to explore. And And I'll be so glad when they're done. Not because I'm moving on, but because it allows me to have a bigger conversation about how it gets put in practice. And I will say one of the negative things has been, so there's been positive things. One of the negative things is that people read them and they go like, well, this is really heavy, right? So sometimes...
when you say heavy, do you mean as in depressing or?
Both. Right, so I don't want to read 30 pages on implicit bias or whatever that is. Just give me the cliff notes. And that's a tough conversation because there's a lot to unpack there. So I think that's what we're working through right now. And that's our immediate challenge. Now that the first ones are out, the early adopters are excited. But how do we start to peel those layers away to get at the bigger picture of how do we truly change the outlook of the profession?
Well, and I guess, I mean, Natalie, you were talking about the informal rules, because I guess the thing about policy is that it's a formal, clear, explicit framework, but it can be very easily undone by unspoken ambiguities and also informal rules. And I guess it's absolutely the same in architecture as it is in the construction industry. Well, first of all, do you want to talk about that a little bit more, especially perhaps in relation to your Gender on the Tender initiative?
Yeah, I think the other thing is too, what we found was there's a lot of forgetting the new and remembering the old, particularly around those norms, and a lot of the norms we found were gendered. But in terms of moving to Gender on the Tender, what became apparent after we did enormous consultation with a lot of the construction sector is that we found that it's very difficult. I'll rephrase that. Construction sits like architecture in an ecosystem. It's in a life cycle. And by the time you're trying to impose, say, flexibility policies or new formal rules onto a construction site, they've already been squeezed. Their margins are at 3%. They've resourced poorly often, or they haven't resourced for flexibility at all, part-time jobs. So what we realised is that, we had to be talking further up the food chain earlier in the life cycle at the tender stage. And I coined the term Gender on Tender. It's a bit like what is it called? Social procurement, but anyway, it's snappier because it's Gender on the Tender.
I'm trying to get the idea of not putting a woman on a dollar bill.
Yeah, this is one of the downsides of Gender on the Tender. Is my understanding of it is that men have gender too. Novel, I know. But that's been one of the challenges, is that when people hear the term gender, they just think we're talking about targets and recruiting women. But it's much more than that. It's about considering how are you tendering your project. Are you allowing for contractors to employ part-time, shared roles? Are you thinking about the well-being of the workers on site? Because one of the shocking things for me from our research project was that on my first day of shadowing a construction professional, it was a senior superintendent, and by smoko, which is morning tea for those who aren't Australian in the room, he was telling me on the way to coffee that he has a panic attack most mornings on the way into work, and that he has, his drinking's increased. So, and construction's known for heightened substance abuse. But he was lucky, he's still married. So what happened was that what happened to us is we set out to study women, but we ended up speaking a lot to men, particularly about their well-being and health. And so going back to Gender on the Tender, the thought is to really have clients and financiers and even designers consider what the implications of their project design is on the people who are doing the building work, and to have maybe some measures in place like counting the number of, I know this is morbid, but counting the number of suicides that occur on your site, because data, what gets counted counts. And similarly, the retention rate of women, but also looking at how are you delivering your job? Are you delivering it on a 5-day work week, or are you just doing the norm, which is a 6-day creeping to a 7-day? We've put forward this idea to government, and I mean, it's exciting. The Green Building Council have intimated to us that they will start looking at social sustainability in terms of their points now in the revised new Green Star. So that is somewhat considering the people who are building those jobs at the early stage. And we're hoping to build, we've got some traction. There is some state task force, cultural task force, that are looking at procurement as a way to really leverage and shift change in the sector. But what I will say is there is still resistance. And one of the saddest things that was said to me recently by somebody who works for a developer is, I just don't think that it's so far down the food chain, we can't see the harm that's being done to humans on these sites. So we're not, they're not willing to then reconsider the time and cost boundaries in their tenders. So I think, government needs to lead on it, and then hopefully private sector will follow suit and live their true values.
It's fascinating that you mentioned that when people see the word gender, they think targets.
Yeah.
Which is, something I guess we're familiar with. And targets obviously is a fairly, contentious kind of, there's certainly differing opinions on targets. But Amy, am I right in thinking that you found the Australian Institute of Architects gender equity policy very useful in that regard?
Yeah, it's interesting because I had a situation last year. I've never sort of thought about, I knew that, the policy was introduced in 2013 with a huge amount of work with Parlour and the Institute and, extraordinary number of people, members who've contributed their time to that over the years. And I always knew that it was there, but I'd never sort of thought about it. And in my role last year, I came up against a situation where we were asked as the Institute to endorse a speakers program that was part of, that was being supported by the government. And we were given the speaker list, and it was all men. And at that stage, I think 50% of the speakers had been confirmed it was all men. And so very quickly we sort of sat down and said, look, we don't sort of think this is going to really work. How can we fix this? And there was sort of a bit of, we'll try. And so I remember I gave Michael Smith a call and I just said, okay, I've read the policy, but there's nothing definitive in it that I feel like there's a line in the sand that I'm going to be able to sort of stand up to. What do you reckon it is based on the policy? And I think we sort of said, 30%. And so I knew that I had to have a number that I was going to start negotiating with, or else I wasn't going to necessarily get anywhere. And that went on for, I think it was 4 or 5 months. And twice I pulled the pin on our endorsement, and it was a very confronting thing. I'd never sort of dealt with that before, and particularly given that it was government, it was a reputational thing as well. And at times, I think this is the other problem as well. At times you feel like you don't know whether you're overstepping the line. And I felt like the policy was so great, being able to say, we've got a policy. And it was really interesting sitting in the room with a whole lot of people are like, well, we don't have a policy, so we don't really have an opinion about this. And I thought, well, I think we all need an opinion about this. But it was really interesting, the power of the policy, how that could be used as a tool to leverage something and to have a really rock-solid conversation about something and to say, well, I can't go beyond this line. And I think as a result of that, sort of came back to National Council and said, look, and there was work happening in the background with the Gender Equity Committee, but we need to put in place some really rigorous quotas. And I never believed in quotas either until I had to deal with that situation. I just went, we have to have quotas. And I was going to say, Simona, just with this, I feel like I'm about to fall into a conversation which I don't really want to have, but we've just supported a 40-40-20, and that being 40 female, 40 male, and 20, as we say, either male or female or non-binary. And I was thinking maybe with this forward slash thing, maybe it should be 40-20-40, and we don't put the 20 at the end, but maybe that's another conversation. But I think it was a really good example as to how powerful a policy can be, and then sort of strengthening that. And I had another situation several months ago where I was asked to be on a jury, once again government, and I was asking who was on the jury, and I was told who was on the jury, so I thought it was all good. And then was having a conversation, and then some more names came up, and I was like, oh, that sounds like there's more than 3 people on that jury, and there were 6. And I said, oh, it sounds like I'm the only female on that jury. And I said, I'm so sorry, but I'm not going to be able to participate because we have this policy. And I said, I suspect you probably have one too. And then got an email 30 minutes later saying, all changed, all good. And so it was, and so I just think, there's something incredibly powerful about that. And, and I thought it was interesting, this angry, when do we, and, in the background, what do we do? But this sort of thing of, words, action, how do we stand on our own 2 feet? And, the idea of being able to action through being supported by something. And policy is so incredibly important when it's like the rules in the game. If we have rules, then we all know where we stand. And then it's like, no questions asked, that's that. And however, I would say that we're in an incredibly important time in terms of diversity and, and in terms of how we sort of start to talk about inclusion. And, that is, there's a huge amount of intelligence that needs to be brought to the table that I feel that at the moment, we're obviously at the Institute, there's, the Gender Equity Committee is starting to go full steam ahead with that over the next 6 months to be able to establish a diversity and equity and, yes, including everything. But I think, and also obviously introducing the RAP is incredibly important, and that was supported by National Council this year. So there's a whole lot of things that National Council are really supporting. But interestingly enough, we met with National Council the other day, and this 40-20-40 was put in dispute because we had a situation earlier in the year where we had a 50-50 split on our board, on the national board, and then there were basically the elections came in and we ended up with too many females. And so a incredibly valuable female had to step down. And so we're actually now having to, that 40-20-40, we're having to reassess how we actually word it so that there can be an ability to be able to not lose valuable females when we've... in terms of, corporate knowledge, etc. So I think so how do you go about allowing for these variances?
I also think the language is important. When we did the briefing paper for the gender on the tender, we termed it in terms of targets on men. Because I think the other thing is too, whilst we keep the conversation on women, it does just keep the conversation as an issue for women to fix and about women. And it's actually much more than that. So well done on the 40-40-20, I say.
Yeah, 40-20-40, I think that's powerful. And the revisions of the Institute policy, Australian Institute of Architects policy now actually is, follows, now we're following you.
Yeah, I was about to say, I feel like we're now heading.
We're all in this together.
Yeah. And I think, and it's just acknowledging that, it's, what do we participate in, and being very explicit about that, and just saying, let's all just do it together, and, and be very upfront about it and very transparent. And, and I think, the Institute at the moment is undertaking a whole lot of work in relation to novation as well. So, this health and well-being is incredibly important in terms of how we understand the workplace, how we understand the industry at large, in order to be able to support a much more transparent and even playing field. And I think all of that is playing, it's all the same conversation, really.
Absolutely. Jocelyn, you were talking a little bit in your introduction about both the work that you've been doing as part of AILA to embark on a program of activity to improve gender equity. But also you were talking about advocacy for design in the context of Monash and in terms of procurement. I mean, is there something interesting for you here in the, can we have gender on the tender at Monash?
Oh, absolutely. It's going to be the first thing I Google when I get home. So it's something that we've been wanting to get to for some time, and we've been we've got an architect selection committee. We've got the university architect Shelley Penn on that, the Dean of Architecture Shane Murray on that, and so we're the 3 core members. And so we've talked about it informally for some time, and we've affected it informally, some of that change. So we've seen a lot more sort of female-led practices coming into Monash to deliver work. This is consultancy work. It hasn't sort of been formalised yet, and that's something that we're working on doing at the moment. And of course, the next evolution of that would be then influencing our colleagues in project, in project delivery to carry that through to contractor engagement and selection. But we have thought a bit about the sort of health impacts of design and the sort of palettes that we're specifying for our landscapes and our buildings. So I won't say we've come anywhere near close to solving it, but it's certainly right at the forefront of our minds. What is the health and physical impact of the sort of environments that we're asking people to design and deliver? Yeah.
It's we should probably also acknowledge the work that Ellie Giannini has been doing over many years, advocating for consideration of gender in procurement in the university context and elsewhere, and certainly on big projects. I don't know whether Ellie's here, but she's really been a leader in that regard. And it also strikes me as interesting that advocacy and indeed activism around procurement seems to me now becoming much more pronounced around sustainability and climate change. And that, obviously, let's hope all of us are sustainability activists. But it seems to me that it's very interesting to see how there's a kind of new wave of let's say, ingeniousness in the way that people are trying to kind of burrow their way into large institutions and have an impact on questions like sustainability around procurement. I mean, can you draw a comment on that at all?
Well, I think you've phrased it in a really beautiful kind of idealistic sort of way, and I think at the moment we've seen that environmental approach. An environmental approach to the built environment, that doesn't even really make sense, but a sustainability approach to the built environment has got a monetary value now. Like, people aren't interested in supporting businesses that are not sustainable, and they're not interested in, attending universities that also aren't sustainable. So I think and also universities aren't interested anymore in investing in infrastructures that that will then outdate and that we can't sort of maintain in the long run. So I think there's a vested interest all round, let alone the whole livability and, can we actually live on the planet that we're sort of contributing to? That vested interest in making sure that we're all contributing to a future that is sustainable. So I think that's a lot of what's driving it. But there's also, multiple other benefits. So a marketing benefit to sort of saying, well, we've got, the university's just built its first passive house building using cross-laminated timber. There's a lot of opportunity to grow a local industry in that area.
I have a question for the whole panel, whoever wants to take it up. And I guess it's about, we often think about equity, diversity, inclusion. We often think of, the everyday, really, I guess, the workplace, the occasions where people are encountering discrimination often, or harassment, or where policy could be really helpful. But so we're not necessarily thinking about the big institutional frameworks that frame and govern our professions. So what do you think the role or the possibilities for policy at the institutional level actually are? I mean, we've heard some specific examples here, but I mean, are you optimistic or less optimistic about what those possibilities are? Do you want to start, Emily?
I'm very optimistic. Although I didn't exactly paint a rosy picture in the beginning, I think there have been some really significant changes. I'll give you an example. So the video with AL and Simona, there was closed captioning, right? Recently we've been working with World Deaf Architects because they called us out. We were not including the inclusions and the accommodations that they needed to fully participate, and that's an inclusion issue, right? And so at the National Convention this past summer, making sure that every general session had CART, computer-assisted real-time translation. In addition to if you self-identify as deaf or hard of hearing, and you want the opportunity for a sign language interpreter, you can have that. So we put the infrastructure. Of course, there was a lot of hemming and hawing. It's going to cost so much money. It's the right thing to do. You do not want to be on the wrong side of this. So anyway, we implemented it. Two things happened. One of the challenges, and this is in terms of identifying people and ticking the box, right? You might self-identify as deaf and hard of hearing, but there's a lot of us who are hard of hearing who haven't come to terms with identifying with that. Anyway, so that was actually very helpful for those who wouldn't necessarily tick the box, right? As well as those who are English as second language. And something that was a necessity for a certain group actually became a benefit for all. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's a larger metaphor. When we recently did a code of ethics change, and these are the rules by which we all agree as practitioners to follow as members of the Institute. So there was two major ones. One was on sustainability, and that we have to actually have that conversation with every client. You cannot, double negative, you cannot not have that conversation. So that was one part. The second was that we redefined what discrimination means and elevating it from a canon, something general, to an actual rule, an enforceable rule that you can be brought in front of the National Ethics Council for. And what you could discriminate against, which is actually a lot larger than what the previous one had been. So by having those two things in place, we now have the teeth to have a larger conversation when offenses come up. And I think the Me Too movement, Time's Up, all that fun stuff, has really challenged what we thought were responses in place. And I'm going to stop myself shortly. We didn't have a protocol in place until there was a problem. Until we had a situation where we needed to double check to see if a recognition was tied into a lot of talk or chatter about that. And we've done a deep dive with a consultant recently, thinking about what are the protocols that we need to have in place in terms of recognizing people. Because often when someone comes up for an award, it's only the recommendations of sort of their good work. And how can we create space and opportunity for those who might have a differing opinion to then come forward? And I think ultimately we have to become a culture of reporting and be able to listen and hear that reporting. And know that that's not a detriment to us as an organization. That's actually a strength. And so there's been a lot of deep policy change that I never thought I'd be doing. But good work.
Anyone else want to take that one?
I was just going to reflecting back on what I was saying before. I think often there's a very overt reaction to. If we talk about diversity, there's in society we have people who don't understand or don't want to understand or haven't had the ability to be given the tools to understand. And then I think there's also those who might not have thought about it, and so not necessarily right or wrong. And I think a lot of this stuff is just about education, and the more we talk about it, the more we rely upon things, the more we have stuff written down and lines in the sand, the easier it becomes for us to sort of operate. And I think more, that situation I was dealing with last year, it wasn't anyone's fault in particular, it just was something that had occurred through circumstance. And so, and everyone was very happy to work together to write it, but it's, these circumstances are the things that are going to trip us up. So how do we, avoid being tripped up or, Yeah.
I think you're right, Naomi. I was thinking about the spectrum that you had earlier, whereas, there's sort of the infancy, I can't say that, where you don't even know there's a problem. In March, I was giving a presentation on the guides, and a gentleman stood up and said, I don't see color. I don't understand why this is a problem. I don't see color. And we're all like, oh, God. And then a gentleman stood up, and his children are mixed race. So he's a white male, and his children are mixed race. And he said, look, when my kids are with me, I want you to see their color, because not seeing that denies their experience and what they identify as. And for me, it was a really powerful moment because it illustrates sort of this dialect, which is there's a whole bunch of architect members who don't really think there's a problem, or, hey, it's not me, I'm not the bad guy. And really sort of saying, well, actually, that in itself, that statement is an issue.
Yeah, in fact, Natalie, when you were speaking earlier and you were talking about these large construction companies being gender blind, that's such an interesting term, isn't it? Because you could imagine someone saying, I'm gender blind. Isn't that great? I don't see gender. But as we know, the difference between equity and equality is that sometimes if you treat everyone with total equality as in exactly the same, it ends up having inequitable effects. So one should not be gender blind because the world is not gender blind, and the effects of gender need to be called out and need to be addressed. So I think it's really interesting when an issue is, so invisible and so ingrained and so encultured that it's not even showing up in policy or anywhere else. Certainly not in what you're talking about with male leaders saying, that's just a non-issue. We don't even have to think about that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that came out of our research was that, for policies to stick, well, firstly I will say that the construction companies' human resources departments hated the word policy, which we found fascinating because we're like, okay, formal rules. But anyway, I'm just
I was going to say, don't they have a safety policy?
They do, but they see it as something that's a bit unattractive, so they'd rather use the term initiative. But just
like value management.
I'm like, I don't care, it's rules. So to that point, one of the things that we found around why the policies didn't stick was that there really needed to be, there was a complete denial of their actual values. And for policies to stick, some of the research will say, I'm taking from Vivian Lowndes from Birmingham University, she's a public policy professor, she sort of says, policies for them to stick, there has to be an alignment of values, but there has to be also that enforcement, like someone's got to care if you're going to break a rule or not. And so it has to be tied to a sanction or a reward. But what was really interesting is the policies that were out there in the field in gender equality, that valued flexibility and part-time work. Well, in reality, what was valued in construction, the behaviours valued in construction, were long hours, total availability, practices of presenteeism. So there was a complete disconnect in terms of, the policy and the practice, and that's why those policies really didn't stick. And the other thing I kind of felt was because they were being authored by people in head office who didn't, there wasn't the revisability component. So the people from site weren't feeding back and saying, well, we've actually, on our site, we've tried this. And so, to have that sort of leeway within the policy to tailor it and to also allow for innovation. I have to say there just wasn't the stamina. And part of that, I guess, to your point before of how positive, and on one hand, I feel quite optimistic, strangely, despite the fact of doing this research, but there is a good deal of resistance and backlash and it is that sort of behind the hands or undercutting, I sort of feel, that's at play here. But part of me thinks that we're on the right track because at least it's not indifference.
Exactly.
It's backlash. So people are feeling like the status quo is being challenged.
Yeah. I meant to add, agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it's a very positive outlook, I think, and it's just you just got to be on notice. But I think it's a very positive outlook.
What do you think in the landscape architecture profession? How's that looking?
I think it's probably the thing that I've been most contacted about, our draft policy. And I can't really talk about the effect. It's heavily informed by the 2 reports produced by Parlour, but I'm hoping that we'll have a lot of feedback on it, and that'll help to make it stronger. We've written it from the vantage point of not just about how can the policy influence AILA or its members, but how can our members also use it to affect broader changes around them, because I think what we've all acknowledged in our various discussions is that gender equity isn't going to happen just because we care about it, or or that our professions care about it, or that women care about it. It's a systemic thing, and it has to be addressed in the round. So that's where, that's what we've aimed at. We've placed it in language that will hopefully enable you to have a discussion with government, to have a discussion with, putting my manager hat on now, with a client, and to sort of say that, have you considered this, because what you're doing is not in accordance with the National Institute of Landscape Architects.
So I'm going to ask one more question to the panel, and then we're going to open to the floor. So start formulating your questions, which is, what advice would you all, given your experiences, what advice would you give to others who are seeking to create change from the top, through policy or otherwise? None.
I'm like filtering. It requires a lot of patience. It requires being consistent. It requires saying it 5 times more than you want to. It's not for the faint at heart. At a board meeting in September, board meeting at September, something was coming up, and there was a gentleman who's on the board with me and said, I just don't understand. Why can't we just make this sort of a company-wide? Why can't we just fix this in the firms? Why do we have to have a big policy change? And just sometimes you want to beat your head over. But then, so then the flip side of it is, then you run into someone who has who's new to the profession, and whose life has changed because of some of these policies. And then you realize it's worth it. I want to make sure that every child, every future architect has the opportunity to be a part of this amazing profession. For me, that I have to keep that in mind, and all of these little things that get in the way, that just has to sort of go away. Sorry.
I think you just got to be creative, and I think this morning someone said, if you have to go in and be a hit squad, like I've been doing as a bit of an academic activist, of going in, speaking to the unions around, in construction it's so base, we're just even asking for female toilets on site. So, but just, hitting those soft spots and gaining that base of sort of that guerrilla team of senior leaders and influencers who will help you around to do that. The other thing is to make it a competition. So I noticed with the New South Wales and Victoria government cultural task force, we recently, I drafted a proposal for the Green Building Star, and straight away the chairperson there said, if any of the construction companies don't sign up to this, well, then I don't know what you're doing on this council. Well, all these big builders want to build for the government, so of course over a long weekend they all just signed up, and little do they know what they've really signed themselves up to. So I think that sort of pressure of creative pressure of competition is another way of getting around it.
Yeah, I agree. I think speaking to the values of the people who are making those decisions, for ourselves it was, to be inclusive is to be leading. So, every time we're sort of wanting to introduce an idea, I guess, so this is what the university had on, but any time we're wanting to introduce change or an idea, we'll benchmark it against, platforms that are world leading, and use that as our sort of base from which to argue for change.
Putting gender, if we talk about innovation, what we've raised, the Institute, which has been, I think, as members, what we've been calling for a really long time is, policy advocacy and research, and the research supporting policy making, allowing us to then advocate. And I think that's being fully supported now by our CEO who came in at the beginning of the year. And so what's really interesting about that space is talking through evidence-based data. And I mean, you guys are very familiar with that, but the power of that means that we can then, this National Novation Survey that we've done, we didn't know what was going to come out of it. Working also with AILA and PIA so that we're not 11,000 members, we're 20,000 members, going into meetings with government with the 3 organisations, not just us, not whinging, just talking, and also talking through data. And, and just saying, I'm really sorry, but 71%, it's really likely that products are going to be substituted, which means that sustainability is going to drop. 59%, you're not going to be able to renegotiate your fee after you're novated. So there's something going on there. So all these, and it just allows you to have, it's a non-emotional conversation, and it's just about, these are the facts, how can we fix it together? And I think that's sort of the approach that we're trying to take, and collaborating rather than sort of saying, look, it's your problem. It's actually all of our problem. No one's winning, so how do we make it work together? And I think that's sort of something that we've been trying to do.
I think we're going to open to questions from the floor. Does anyone have a question? There's a question.
Thank you. Amazing. Well done. Natalie, I've got a quick question for you. You just mentioned at the end that, when you threatened the builders if they didn't sign up. Then
I didn't threaten.
No, not you threatened. No, you were talking about
the chairperson did.
The chairperson. Yeah. Was that a man or a woman? But anyway,
it was a female.
That's brilliant. I'm interested in just extending that a little bit to the Champions of Change policy. And I know that the Institute, when I was on National Council, was discussing Champions of Change. I have a bit of a problem with Champions of Change in the sense that it's something you sign up to, and you can advocate and say that we're doing all of this stuff. And I know that they're trying to bring it into WA, and I've gone to the firms that had Champions of Change, national firms, and they said, oh, yeah, we'll do it later. I also know the CEO of Gender Equity Task Force in WA. It's a funded organisation where big mining companies come in and they pay $30,000 to be part of it, and then they do Champions of Change. The reality is, though, that when the firms are, I've had letters from architects who are in different parts of Australia, and they're talking about, yeah, Champions of Change is fantastic, but it's actually not filtering down. And so it's not helping those middle range architects of, 35 to 50 or 45 that are wanting that flexibility. Do you have anything to say about that sort of, is there a problem when we get people to sign up? Yay, because then I can be on the bandwagon. But, is it actually happening, and how do we quantify that? So that's for everybody.
Phew, I thought I was going to have to make a comment on male Champions of Change.
Do you have gender parity in schools today?
Roughly. Jill's the person to talk about this. It's been around about 40% women, and on the way up. 44.
44. Right. So I guess we struggle with sort of the gold star type of thing where, should we do a certification so people can challenge for it, et cetera, et cetera. I think we know that in U.S. culture there will be a minority majority. Some project as soon as 2060. But it's never really solved the gender issue because we've actually had parity in the schools for the last 25 years. And so how do you account for the fact that women actually leave? Equity by Design in San Francisco found 2 pinch points between 0 and 3 and 10 to 15. And we knew that was a huge workplace culture issue, which is why, and I don't know anything about that initiative specifically, but understanding that focusing on the workplace helps to address the gender issue, but it doesn't address other systematic frameworks that are at play, especially with Black or African American architects, Latino, Asian American, Native American architects. There's less than 200 licensed, which is a whole other conversation. But that required different initiatives in the elementary and secondary education, as well as scholarships, as well as sort of other foundational issues that we had to tackle. And so I'm a fly on the wall on this one, but I think some of the initiatives that we see in terms of fixing firms doesn't address the systematic frameworks and the inequity at play in the larger culture.
I think you've probably summed it up. I also think too that, to your point, it's as long as male champions of change isn't the silver bullet or seen as the one silver bullet, a bit like unconscious bias training was, that those male champions are going back to their companies and changing the structures and possibly even relinquishing their chair. That's where I think the really interesting thing is, who's willing to move out of that place of privilege, and are they? Because it's a slow move. I just think that there needs to be a variety approach, not just one. And if the cost of doing one initiative is so extreme that you are unable to do others, then that's questionable.
It's maybe your question also opens this idea about virtue signalling, which is of course a term or a concept that tends to be used by people on the right to blame people on the left for being on their high horse and holier than thou and painful. But I guess also the concept of virtue signalling is that you get all the credit and the benefits from being virtuous, but in fact you're not actually carrying it through. That's not a question. Is there another question?
It's a good comment.
Hello, I have a question. I am from a regional city in Tasmania, and we have a local Women in Architecture group, and I'm on the National Committee for Gender Equity for the Australian Institute of Architects. And one of the things that we come across in conversation locally in the profession, which is a pretty active but small group of professionals in Tasmania, as you can imagine, with a smaller economy, but that things like flexibility in practice, part-time work, all of those things which generally support women, but also other caregivers and other professionals who may want to have some kind of flexible career, but maintain their career. There's always negative kind of responses around that and feedback in terms of financial viability. Running very small practices with often, I think probably the biggest practice in Tasmania maybe has about 15 people in it. So they're very small practices, they're really stretched, and they're still competing for jobs that, mainland practices are also competing for. So we're kind of, I suppose, stretched and doing government work and so forth. So Natalie, I suppose I'm interested to know, has there been any research done around the financial modelling and impacts and or benefits of, say, gender on the tender for consultancy tenders, not just construction tenders, from government organisations, and how that could be, I suppose, delivered? For example, we have in Tasmania, if you put a government submission in, there's a policy around violence against women, which you are signing up to, and that applies to consultants and also contractors for construction work, but there's nothing about, I suppose, practice sustainability and supporting, different modes of practice.
Can I ask you a return question? In your tenders, is there a way you can put an innovation component in?
Yes, yeah, there usually is.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I just know from anecdotal practice that's what others have been doing. So recently in New South Wales, a contract for a hospital was one where the contractor turned up with the 6-day week contract for the required time of the program, and she proceeded to say, here's your contract, that's the cost. However, do you understand the consequences of this contract? You'll likely have a number of suicides, you'll have marriage breakdowns, blah, 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 and went through the shopping list of it, and then said, and here's something I've prepared for you earlier, which is a 5-day work week. Let's study it, because I don't think there is the data in to support you in that. It's costing the client, who is New South Wales Health, $2 million more and taking them 10 weeks longer. But as a hospital and New South Wales Health, how can you, who provide services to men's health at a critical level, knock that back? And so they've brought in us as researchers, and we'll be studying that. So I think that one of the opportunities is maybe to offer it as an innovation component and maybe even suggest studying it. Because going back to your point, I think research is really important in terms of shifting the understanding around flexibility and outputs and, the needs of the workforce. So.
The Institute of Architects has actually drafted national procurement guidelines. I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at those, but I was part of the task force that was on that and brought obviously the client perspective to it. And we get a lot of feedback around, the consultant tenders take so much time to input to, and so in developing that aspect of the procurement guidelines, we actually looked at, how much information really needs to go in an EOI, and also, what is the cost versus benefit, because you're competing against so many more people in an EOI, and we sort of said that, that should be capped at, like 10 pages pre-established sort of content, and not asking for too much tailored content. And then, as the tenders get smaller in terms of the pool of architects that they're going out to, that they might ask for more money and offer sometimes remuneration for, where they're actually asking for quite a lot of specialised content or customised content. So I think I don't think we're near sort of really solving it. I'm not sure if that really kind of answers your question, but I think it's definitely on people's minds, and work has commenced in Australia. As far as I'm aware, it's still in draft form. It's been sent out for comment, so to the Victorian Government Architects Office has endorsed it, the New South Wales Government Architects Office has endorsed it. I'm not sure how much further it's gone at this stage.
We've certainly been active in Tasmania, taking it around to the relevant, government bodies and so forth with that document. I suppose it's really more about the actual, less about the submission process itself, but more about the actual job when you're doing it, and supporting small practices to achieve those flexible part-time working arrangements.
Yeah,
in a competitive way.
I think more work needs to be done there, because it's so emerging in terms of that mode of practice. And I know Simone Bliss Landscape Architects are doing quite a lot of that. That's a practice that is modelled only on part-time work. Everyone in that practice only works 4 days or less. I think they're all female or predominantly female, and they all have flexible working hours. I think there's only one day when everyone is required to come into the office, just so that they can have their sort of regular catch-ups and things. But I don't know of a lot of other practices who are doing that yet, but I think it will certainly start to catch on as we learn more and more about, from pioneers like yourselves and like SBS LA, how we can all adopt a model like that and do it even better.
Thank you.
More questions? Just one here.
If there isn't a question, I want to ask one of you.
Hi, thank you all. And I love the organization of this conference to have both the grassroots and from the top panels in one day, just before and after lunch. This is not a fully formed question, but I want to speak about some government policy that you respond to. I know in the US, we have recently reformed overtime policy that certainly affects architects. And one of my favorite things to rally against is the fact of, I'm sorry to be talking to you guys in Australia about this, but we have no maternity leave. We have horrible health and parental leave policies.
We're the worst.
We're the worst.
Or we're the second to the worst.
Or the second to worst. And the Family Medical Leave Act was a big deal in 1993, but it only applies to firms that are over 50 people, and I believe still about 90% of architecture firms are less than 20 people. So most architects aren't even governed by this minimal law. So I know this is kind of, Emily, I'm sorry, you guys are in some ways powerless, but these are things that would disproportionately affect architects, and I wondered how in the Australian context, some of these labour laws, sometimes push you or you push against them.
I don't know whether I'm in a position to talk about gender in that capacity. I feel like I could talk about planning. I haven't, to be honest, I haven't, in my role, haven't come across that. But I don't know whether Justine could speak to that.
One thing I'd say, I think we're in a slightly better position than the US, but I think the thing that
much better position
Australia has, which is really underactivated as an architect's award, there is a mandated minimum wage with standard working hours, and overtime is to be recompensed at time and a half. So the award wage is very low, but we know that it's consistently underpaid. There are lots and lots of practices that still don't even pay the award wage. Now, it would seem to me that there's a kind of instrument there which is often really underutilised. It's underknown. People, lots of architects don't even seem to know it exists. Employers constantly flout it. I would say, to the credit of the Employer Association, the ACA, with which I work, so I should give you a little, full disclaimer. But they argue very strongly against unpaid internships. People not even following the most basic legal requirements. But we do have them. It's not a especially strong award. We've also got a union, which seems to be entirely unstrong. We have the architecture lobby starting up here, so there's a lot, which is fantastic. So we do have some instruments that I think are really underused and underutilised, and it would be great to see the Institute of Architects, for example, using its code of conduct in relation to the minimum requirements of the award, and starting to actually start policing.
What I meant by responding to your question was specifically government coming to us and obviously saying, this is what we're thinking of right now, what do you reckon, in a consultation mode. They've never, in my role to date, they've never approached us in that regard. We've been talking to government about how to strengthen our Architects Act, because it's hasn't been reviewed for a very long time, and there's certainly some deficiencies within that act that we've been working with the ARBV, the registration board, and campaigning to government over the last year. So, but in our capacity, in terms of the way that we operate, we've never had government come and talk to us specifically about wages and employment conditions in terms of that being a conversation.
Look, there's certainly a set of policies that could be better activated.
100%. 100%. And I think, the complication that we have in Australia with the Architect Act is that we have one in each state. So we don't have a national act, which is incredibly frustrating because it means that each state is operating in a different capacity, and it means that we also have less power to campaign federally because we've all got different acts.
The Architects Act's one thing, but the Architects Award is nationally
fair
work.
Yep.
So that's a national minimum standard, and we need to be holding practices to account against that as an absolute minimum. Not as some sort of fancy thing you can do if you've actually got paid some fees lately. Anyway, I'm very opinionated about this.
Maybe it's the last question. I didn't plan this, Amy, but I'm going to put you on the spot. Thinking about Emily's discussion about revision of the Code of Ethics in the American Institute of Architects. In fact, that was something that we were planning, our research team was planning to assist the Australian Institute of Architects with in our earlier research project. We never quite got around to it. Could it be that the Australian Institute of Architects Code of Ethics or Code of Conduct, I can't quite remember what it's called.
Code of Conduct.
Could be revised so that it is, at present, it is entirely gender blind. Could it be revised?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We're going through a process at the moment in terms of all of that being reviewed, and, it's also to do with member behaviour. How do we actually behave together. So all of that is reviewed, in terms of the relationship between staff versus members in a membership organisation. How do we understand that landscape? So all of that's currently under review, and I think it's really interesting because I think so many of these policies have overlaps, and how can we make them all talk? And I think at the moment the failing that we've had in the past with the Institute policies is that they're not referencing each other, they're sort of cutting and pasting. And so one of the administration tasks that's in hand at the moment is how we can have one policy here that references all those other policies. So the talking between policies, I think, is a very good point. Yep.
Please join me in thanking Amy Muir, Jocelyn Chiew, Natalie Galea and Emily Grandstaff-Rice.